I was born in 1938, and we lived in Dovercourt, and we lived there throughout the Second World War. And one thing that people tend to forget is that where we were on a bombing run from the German bombers heading for London. That wasn't such a problem, except that my mother used to put my brother and myself under the stairs of our house, our two up, two down house. And I don't know what people did in a bungalow, but there it is. We were okay under the stairs. And sometimes that we would go to sleep there and wake up in our own beds. But the real problem was when the German bombers came back to go back to their bases in France. They were at the extreme end of their range, so any unused bombs and anything else they could throw out were dropped on Harwich before they went across the North Sea. And that was when we had the problems.
I was born October 1939, just weeks after the outbreak of the war. I was born in Woodham Ferrers, but we moved shortly to Great Baddow because my father had a job at Hoffman's ball bearing factory and he worked nights. We lived in a council house. We had I can see the layout in my mind now, but the living room was a long front to back room, and with a large portion taken up with the Morrison shelter. Because there wasn't room for a table, we used to use the Morrison shelter to eat off of, play games on, snakes and ladders, tiddlywinks, that sort of thing. I remember, and of course at night my mother and I, and latterly my sister, used to sleep in it. We had a long back garden with a grassy path down the middle, and both sides were totally dug and planted out with vegetables and fruit bushes, etc., to keep us going because of the shortages. We had chickens up near the house, which used to supply us with eggs, and occasionally I think one went into the pot. Meat was very scarce, so Mum used to supplement it by making a thing called a suety pudding, which was like a large dumpling. She used to put it in a cloth, tie it up with a piece of string, and boil it in a pan of boiling water for goodness knows how long. When she took it out, it used to be shiny and very white, I remember. And she used to slice it up and pour gravy on it, and we used to have it as a sort of starter, and it was nice. And of course, by the time you got to the meat course, it was also as it was also very filling. You didn't mind that there wasn't much meat, and you weren't really particularly hungry by then. I think as a pudding, we probably had stewed fruit, things like that, semolina, I seem to remember, cremola, which was a sort of custardy thing, which I used to be quite fond of, I remember. I started school when I was 4.5, went to the local village school. Our first classroom had a stove in the middle, a big black stove with a grill round, fence round it, and teacher used to put our morning milk round it in the winter so that it took the chill off. And they had wide neck bottles and used to push your finger through the cardboard and put the straw in.
We, as kids, got to know about the doodle bugs, but on one occasion, uh, the word went around Dovercourt and Harwich that a doodle bug had come down and hadn't exploded. And it had come down in a group of trees where the outdoor swimming pool in Upper Dovercourt was. And of course, when the word went around, we all had to look at this thing. This thing that caused so much devastation, etc. But so hundreds of people, including my mother and myself, hundreds of people ran down up to Upper Dovercourt, and there it was, in some trees, smoke coming out of it, but it hadn't gone off. Now it doesn't. First question was, when will it go off? But at the time, the Army Bomb Disposal Unit was crawling all over it, and there was one solitary policeman, and I'll never forget what he said. There's hundreds of people swarming around this doodlebug, and all he could say is, move along, nothing to see here, nothing to see here. And there's a doodlebug behind him, emitting smoke, and an army bomb disposal. Nothing to see there, he said. And we all had a good laugh at that one.
Used to listen to the radio, well, we called it the wireless a lot. Used to listen to Uncle Mac and Children's Hour and something called Monty and Peckham, I remember, which was about a cat and a dog, I think. My father used to listen to the wireless a lot. He liked Itmar and it used to make him laugh a lot, but I never really understood why, because it was all above me at that age. He used to be a Bing Crosby fan, I remember that. Vera Lynn must have featured very strongly, but I don't remember her at all, except I vaguely remember Bluebirds Over the White Cliffs of Dover song. The one thing that brings back memories of that to me is the Andrews sisters singing Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree. Why, I don't know. It's just one of those weird things you remember. There was a group sang it on VE Day celebrations a couple of months ago, and it brought it totally back to me, those days.
Parkston, just up the river from Harwich, at the time was a naval base, a very important naval base. And the Germans had the idea that they'd send a U-boat up the river and blast a few ships. The U-boat that they selected, the captain unfortunately had rather old maps. So he came across, and then people at the time knew about the submerged sandbank just outside Harwich, the submerged sandbank, and the German captain, of course, didn't know about that. So the U-boat got stuck on the sandbank. He managed to reverse it off, and then he was lost. So this is at night. So he decided that he'd have a go at making it to Harwich and then up the river to Parkston and sink a few ships. He didn't get that far because he was still lost when he headed towards where he thought was Harwich and decided that he better surface and find out where the hell he was. So he did. He surfaced, popped out the conning tower, and straight under the 303 rifle held in the trembling hands of an army sentry on Harwich Pier. The sentry, allegedly, was so shocked to see this U-boat surface in front of him and the captain come out and have a look round. He was so shocked that all he could say, or shout, was hands hot. And, believe it or not, the captain surrendered. So he was taken off with his crew, and they were all taken up to Tollgate to join their fellow Germans in the prisoner of war camp. I think that sentry must have dined out on that story for years and years and years.
I remember one night, because we used to listen for things called doodlebugs. I think they were originally the original rocket, the predecessor to V2, but we called them doodlebugs. And they used to hum. You could hear them coming, drone, drone, drone. And you used to listen very carefully because while the engine was going, you were safe. But once it stopped, the bombs used to drop. And one evening, one splattered and stopped over our house. Well, it sounded like it. And I remember my mother flinging my sister and myself into the Morrison shelter and scrambling in herself. But luckily for us, there was a sort of splutter, and it started up again and it went off. Obviously dropped somewhere else. I remember the barrage balloons over Chelmsford. Never struck me as anything out of the ordinary because I guess that was just part of life. I knew nothing better in those days. I don't ever remember feeling particularly frightened by anything, except one morning an airman came to the back door and my mother he spoke to my mother. I don't know what it was about, obviously, but she went very rigid and still, and I could sense that she was shocked. And she went and sat down, and I remember standing beside her crying. It wasn't until years after I realised the significance of that memory. That was the morning after the V2 rocket landed on Hoffman's just before Christmas 1944, and a lot of people were killed, and my father had been very badly injured. He had bad head injuries, and they didn't think he would survive, but thanks to a very clever surgeon called Mr. Shepherd, he operated, put a plate in his head, and he lived to the great old age of 91 and led a pretty normal life for the rest of his life. I remember him being at home afterwards, making me some doll's house furniture out of an old tray that Mum had. And also once when we were out in the garden, finding some silver paper strips. And I learned later, I think it was called window, and he plaited them into a garland, and we used to use it every Christmas as decoration. I think it was dropped to try and upset the enemy radar. I remember nothing about VE Day at all, which seems very strange to me because it must have been a tremendous time. There must have been parties and street parties and everything, but I remember absolutely nothing of that nature. Maybe it was because it was a few months after my father had been badly injured and things were more subdued for us.
Right, my story is all about Bletchley Park. You may have heard of Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park was where the code-breakers in the Second World War did their wildest things. And the Enigma story, which was what they called Ultra, and a few other bits and pieces were activities performed there. And one of the other activities, one of the most important ones towards the end of the war, was the Colossus computer. The Colossus computer was the first fully programmable, world's first programmable computer. So in 1997, I went to Bletchley Park as part of a trip from work, and my work at that time was at GC Marconi Research Centre at Great Baddow in Chelmsford. When we got to Bletchley Park, we had a look around, and one of the things that was being undertaken at that time was the rebuild of the Colossus computer under the jurisdiction of a chap called Dr. Tony Sale. On the viewing gallery wall, overlooking the rebuild project, there were some photographs, and one of which I recognised some of the post office engineers that in the Newmanry, as they called the hut in Bletchley Park, because some of the gentlemen in the photograph were uncles when I was a child, and my father, my late father, was there as well. My father actually passed away in 1973, and my mother did not know anything about what he did at Bletchley Park. He wasn't allowed to say. Suffice to say that my father got transferred to GCHQ in Cheltenham, and the Cheltenham story, because I was born in Cheltenham, is another thing. So basically, my mum did not know anything about what he did. Indeed, she thought he was a telephone engineer working in Bletchley, and it was quite a shock, but an amazing story to find out that he was one of the technician engineers that operated and kept maintaining the Colossus computer under the jurisdiction of Tommy Flowers. So when I returned back to Great Baddow, I obviously was very, very overwhelmed, and I started researching quite a bit, and I found out where my uncles from my childhood were living. There were only about 6 of them that I could go out and interview, but it was very interesting to hear their stories. The interesting thing was that the notices about what they did at Bletchley Park allowed them to talk about it, but only in response to questions. So they wouldn't volunteer any part of the story at all. It's very, very strange. But there we go. So as time's gone on, the GC Marconi Research Centre became part of BAE Systems, which is from the merger of British Aerospace and GC Marconi, and it became the BAE Systems Applied Intelligence Laboratory at Great Baddow. And I retired from that laboratory in January 4 years ago, which was quite an amazing. It was good to retire and be able to research more the story about my dad. When I realised that when Tony Sale died, his obituary referred to the fact that he worked at Great Baddow. And the interesting thing was that he worked with Peter Wright of Spycatcher fame and on the Doppler radar at Great Baddow when it was the Marconi Research Centre. Interestingly also, Gordon Welshman was a very important part of Bletchley Park. He is regarded as the father of cryptoanalysis, which is all to do with radio traffic location and mapping, so that they knew where the confluences were from Germany about where the messages were coming from Hitler and his generals. So Gordon Welshman was the father of cryptoanalysis, and the Applied Intelligence Laboratory, part of BAE Systems at Great Baddow, part of their activity is associated cryptoanalysis, although they're not looking at Morse code, they're looking at complex codes. So that's it, really.
A friend I had who was in the same road as me, called Popeye Thurlow. Popeye had this bad habit of falling under vehicles, and on one occasion, towards D-Day, the main road between Dovercourt and Harwich was full of army vehicles heading for Harwich Port to go across to France. And there were tanks, rain gun carriers, etc. We hadn't seen any of these things before. And Popeye was standing between myself and another friend, and we thought, is he going to go under something? Well, he did. He went under a tank. The tank didn't touch him, but he went under it anyway and went to hospital. And Popeye was one of those kids that things happened to. And whenever we went to see his mother and say, can Popeye come out to play? She said, well, no, he's in hospital. And I think Popeye spent more time in hospital than he did at home.